Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Q&A session today. We're going to be talking about Amazon WorkSpaces. We're going to get going just in maybe a minute or two. All right, welcome to the stream, folks. If maybe somebody could just verify for me the audio sounds okay on your side, that'd be fantastic. The intent for today is really just to talk a little bit about Amazon Workspaces and answer any questions. We do have a couple little slides to go through, some best practices, things like that. But if you wanted to ask a specific question, maybe you're in the midst of using Workspaces or deploying Workspaces right now, be more than happy to just answer any questions that you might have. Okay. Let me just change the setup. So I've got here just the main Workspaces client page. Once you've got everything set up, you're going to need to download a client. You can use the web browser to do this, but I find the client a little easier. We'll come back to that in a second, though. I thought what we'd do today is just talk a little bit about a reference architecture that you could use to help with Workspaces. But I guess prior to talking about what that architecture may look like, for those of you that just aren't quite sure about Workspaces, Workspaces allow you to deploy virtual desktops running on the Amazon platform. You can run both Windows, Amazon Linux, and Ubuntu workstations right now, so you've got some flexibility. And you also have the ability to use things like the Workspace Application Manager, or WAM, to build your own bundles, push software out, and maintain software on your workspaces. So a lot of flexibility. Just last week, we've helped a customer deploy several hundred workstations or workspaces into their environment as everybody is shifting the way they're working right now because of the situations out there. So it's a really good solution to help you kind of navigate these, what I'm calling right now, interesting times. And Amazon recently announced that they're also providing workspaces up to a certain level. I'd always check the latest news from them, but I think the last time I read it, 50 workspaces free of charge for a certain period of time. So have a look at that. Might be a good way to kick the tires and see if this is a solution that makes sense for you. What I've got on the screen now is I mentioned a reference architecture. So the Workspaces solution is a VPC aware solution, meaning that we're going to have to deploy these desktops into a virtual private cloud or a VPC. The VPC that I'm showing here, it's kind of a standard deployment that we would use with a customer that requires a VPC for their environment. And it's really broken down into 4 subnets, 2 public and 2 private. Best practice, again, would be to ensure that you're spreading the subnets across multiple availability zones within a single region. So what we've got here is, let's say AZA and AZB, and we've got a public and private subnet in each of those. We've connected this VPC to the outside world. We've got an internet gateway up here at the top, right, connecting us to the public internet. And at the bottom of the diagram, I've just shown the virtual gateway, the VGW. Sometimes you'll see this as the VPG as well, as a way to connect back to your on-prem environment. So this is kind of a foundation. It's I think a good way to get started with Workspaces, but you could use this foundation for any number of solutions where you need a VPC if you're deploying EC2 instances, RDS databases, things like that. The goal would be obviously to protect the workspaces from direct public access from the internet. And the way that we're going to do that is deploying those workspaces in a private subnet. So in those two blue squares at the back. Having said that, they do need internet access. It's a requirement. And you have a couple options. You can deploy your workspaces in a public subnet and give them public IPs as part of the subnet configuration. So when you're deploying your subnet, you can enable automatic assignment of public IP addresses. If that's the case and you deploy a workspace there, it automatically will get a public IP and therefore internet access. Depending, I guess, on your route table. The other option is still deploying them in a public subnet, but manually assigning public IP addresses. I guess in a real pinch, if you're trying just to get something done and maybe pushing this into an existing VPC, that might be an option. Our suggestion, or my suggestion, would be that you deploy them in private subnets. So in order for those resources, the workspaces, to get access to the internet, they're going to need to work through something else, right? They're going to have to traverse or transmit data. I'm all tongue-tied here, through something else. In our case, what we've done is we've deployed 2 NAT gateways. Again, a NAT gateway for each availability zone. There are costs associated with the NAT gateways, but it is an effective way to limit direct public access to these resources, workspaces or otherwise. So you can see kind of we're building on top of that foundation. WorkSpaces does require directory services. Now, you can get away with, remember, Linux workstations, either AWS Linux or Ubuntu or Windows workstations. The directory needs to be created prior to deploying workspaces. The directory service actually supports a number of options. So you could do a standalone simple AD deployment, you could use an AD connector, or you could stand up a full Active Directory solution on the Amazon platform. In the last week, what we've actually seen a lot of our customers do is deploy Active Directory connectors. So I'm not quite sure if this is exactly the best way to describe the connector service, but the way that I like to think about it is almost like a proxy. It's basically going to connect back to your resources, an existing directory solution on-prem. Okay. It still sets it up in a multi-AZ environment, so you have high availability whether you're using a connector, or a full Active Directory deployment, but it is a requirement before you can deploy workspaces. Okay. So the directory service is actually going to go back through, in our example here, the virtual gateway, which is going to give us either a VPN connection over the public internet or potentially going through a DX connection back to your on-prem environment. So the directory service can talk to your on-prem directory, establish a trust relationship if you need it. One other thing on that, if you do require trust relationships, the only directory service solution that supports that is the full AD deployment. So connectors and simple AD, you can't establish trust relationships. Once the directory is deployed, then we can go ahead and start our workspaces deployment. At this point, you register your directory solution you register your workspaces deployment with the directory service, and you can either start creating users in the directory, or if you've connected that directory to something existing already, then you'll be able to search for users and associate them with workspaces. So this is a pretty basic reference architecture. We've used it several times over the last week or so as more and more of our customers start implementing work from home solutions for their employees. It's simple, it's effective, and it'll get you going really fast. And in a lot of cases, if we had more time to plan this, we might take a slightly different route as far as a full Active Directory environment that allows us to share that directory across multiple environments. In this event, these again interesting times mean that in some cases we've had to do things a little quicker for our customers, and this is a great reference architecture that you could use to stand it up very quickly and get access to the resources that you need. A couple other things, actually, before we move on, anybody have any questions? If you want, you can just throw them right in the chat window. I'm keeping an eye on the chat window as we're walking through this. So if something comes up, you just have a general question, feel free to throw that into the chat window, and I'll see if I can answer it. If I can't answer it, I'll definitely take a note and we'll broadcast a solution or post something on the blog later on for that question. Before getting going on this presentation today, I wanted to basically set up that reference architecture and walk everybody through it. So the first thing I wanted to show was the VPC that we created. And I'll just filter here. So based on that diagram that we saw earlier on, here's our VPC. And we've got those 4 subnets. Okay, so 2 public and 2 private subnets spread across 2 availability zones. And you can see here that what we've done is we've created very large, if I just highlight these 2 right here, very large private subnets. And again, this is a really good best practice. One of the things that we've seen customers struggle with over the last week or so is not having enough space. Okay, and there are some challenges as far as directory services associating it with additional subnets and things like that. So you need to plan ahead a little bit here. And if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have enough space for the workspaces that you require for your employees, then what we've done for our customers over the last week is deploy new VPCs. And this is a good example of where it's maybe not ideal, but getting up and running and getting your employees access to the environments is what's most important. So sometimes you might have to be a little flexible. In our reference architecture, though, you can see that both of our private subnets are /20 CIDR blocks. So we would have, in theory here, if I wanted to use this, I would have a lot of space to deploy workspaces. Another thing just to keep in mind is WorkSpaces does have a soft limit, and I would always check the documentation on this, but the last time I looked, I think the soft limit was only 15 workspaces. So it doesn't give you a lot of space, right, for any organization of any size. What I would do is immediately open a support ticket with Amazon. They're going to ask you a few questions because you can imagine there's a lot of people wanting more workspace environments for their deployments. You can walk through those with the tech support person, and usually pretty quickly they can increase the limit of workspaces that you have available, and you can start deploying the solutions for your customers. So in our reference architecture, really small public subnets, but not what I'll call stupid small, and then much larger private subnets. So it gives us the flexibility to deploy the workspaces that we need. And again, I think this is a good reference architecture pretty much for anything that you're going to do that requires a VPC. The general rule is small public subnets, large private subnets. Okay. So we set this up prior to firing up the Q&A session today, and this was all deployed through CloudFormation. So we can do this in an automated way. Okay. Ultimately, CloudFormation, I think, is the right way to do this because it allows you to do it programmatically, ensure that the VPC looks the same every single time you deploy it. So have that reference architecture, build the template, and then use that template across multiple regions or multiple accounts, depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Okay. Another best practice, and not necessarily tied specifically to workspaces, is route tables. Every subnet within our VPC, we assign a unique route table to it. This is another challenge that we've seen over the last week with some of our customers where maybe they've got a single route table for all of their subnets. It might not give them the flexibility they need to route traffic from the workspaces a little differently maybe than they want to route traffic from, let's say, EC2 instances if they're kind of piggybacking on an existing VPC. So if you have the opportunity to plan ahead here, then you should plan ahead and create individual route tables for every subnet within the VPC. In our example here, there's really nothing fancy in this environment. If I select one of our private route tables, you can see that we're leveraging our NAC gateways. So we've got our local route, which we can't change. And then we've got, in our example here, the any route saying, hey, if you're trying to go anywhere other than the VPC, talk to the NAT gateway. Okay. Speaking of the NAT gateways, we have two. Let me just resize this. Okay, one in each availability zone that is covered by our VPC. Okay. Remember that NAT gateways are highly available, scalable solutions, but they're highly available and scalable in the AZ where you've assigned them. So they are going to cost you some money. And I know a lot of times when you read about cost optimization, people talk about that sometimes a NAT gateway may be a little more expensive than a lot of people think, but the way, or think it should be, the way that I approach it is that without a NAT gateway, you may save some money, but you may also introduce a hidden bottleneck within your environment. A lot of cases when we're doing work for customers and the experience they're having, the performance experience that they're having may not be as good as they had hoped. We often find very, very small, old NAT instances. Somebody's deployed like a T2 Nano or a T2 Micro. And remember that the throughput, the network capacity of those instances is dependent on the types and sizes of the instances that you deployed. So if you go with a NAT instance, it may save you money, but it might maybe also become a bottleneck. Whereas the NAT gateway can automatically scale, and it can burst up to, the last time I looked at the documentation, I want to say 25 gigabits. So it can handle a lot of traffic, and it avoids a situation, especially if you start thinking about potentially, dozens, or in a couple of our situations, hundreds of users now pushing traffic through potentially a NAT gateway. It could very quickly become a bottleneck, or sorry, a NAT instance. It could very quickly become a bottleneck. So it's going to cost you a little more, but it gives you a lot more flexibility in the end. Okay, so that's a little bit about the VPC. I also wanted to show the directory that we've created. This is the directory that we created. For the demo today, I created a full AD deployment because we don't have, being fully remote, no office or anything like that, we don't have a centralized AD deployment that we could use a connector. I mentioned already that in most cases, our customers are, if they don't already have a directory solution deployed in AWS with a trust relationship back to their on-prem Active Directory, they are deploying, in some cases, multiple directory connectors, AD connectors, in order to get them up and running quickly. I would say long-term, you would want to create probably a full AD deployment, because the full AD deployment is shareable first off across multiple VPCs. It also gives us a lot more support for workloads running in AWS, things like RDS instances. The list is quite long. So in a pinch, a connector is a great way to get going, especially if you have to do something very quickly, kind of like this week. But longer term, you might want an Active Directory deployment where you have a trust relationship established with your on-prem environment. But the directory service itself is fully managed. In my case today, I deployed this manually through the management console. It does take a little bit of time. I kind of wrote down roughly about a half an hour to deploy a small standard edition Microsoft Active Directory deployment. Obviously, that time's going to vary. You never quite know, but just it's not going to be immediate. If we were doing this for a customer, we would, again, deploy this through some automated tool. Our choice for that is CloudFormation, but ultimately it's up to you to decide what you want. And you can see we've created our DNS information, our NetBIOS information. We've associated the directory with a specific VPC, and the most important part is associating within that VPC the directory with subnets. What we've got here are the two private subnets that we created in our deployment. Okay, so what's happening under the covers is that when we deploy the directory service, we end up with two Active Directory instances running, spread across multiple availability zones within that single region. So highly available. There's replication. What's also great about this service, not specific to WorkSpaces again, is that you can see here maintenance is handled for us. We've associated it with WorkSpaces down here, but you can also associate it with RDS, the management console. A number of other services are supported. So you've got some flexibility and it's fully managed. So it might get you over the hump right now for for satisfying your work for home requirements. But longer term, this really does become what I'll call a foundational service within the majority of deployments that we do for our customers. The most important part, once the directory is actually created, is registering that directory with the WorkSpaces solution. So if I go over to WorkSpaces, what you can see here is in the WorkSpaces services, in the Workspace service, I have a directory associated with the WorkSpaces implementation. Okay, so VPC first, follow that reference architecture to get a solid foundation that protects your workspaces because you can deploy them in your private subnets. In our example, a NAC gateway as the way to get internet access for those workspaces. Then create the directory, and then once that directory creation process has been completed, you can associate it with your workspaces implementation. Okay. A couple things with the directory. You can scroll down here and you can see what other services are supported by the directory and whether or not we've enabled integration of this directory with those services. You can see work docs and things like that. A couple other options that are available here. We've associated this only with WorkSpaces at this point. This directory will only last for the duration of this broadcast, and then we're gonna blow it up in order to save some money in this environment. But you can see we get our DNS addresses, the VPC information, and then these are all the types of features that you can enable. Okay. If you go under update details, we were joking about this just before. We were looking at something for another customer, and I'm a little risk adverse, so I was a little hesitant to click on this, and one of the other guys said, no, this is the right place to click. And we were actually looking for this setting right here, access to the internet. So we were able to find what we were looking for. I was trying to read documentation and excuse me, couldn't find it. But what you're able to do here is determine how your how your workspaces get access to the internet. And you can see a little blurb here. Enable this setting to assign a public IP address to the workspaces in this directory by default. Probably not what you want to do. And it is disabled by default. That's the standard setting. I would encourage you strongly to leave it like that and then use some other mechanism to route traffic to the public internet. A couple of other things. The target domain and organizational unit, by default, it will use the computer's OU in the directory, whether that's a directory running within Amazon or a directory maybe that you've connected to on-prem. It's up to you. You can modify this if you would like, but the default is to use the computer OU, and we left it as the computer OU or computer's OU in this simple demo. Again, it's not going to last very long, so it really wasn't that important. You also have the ability to associate an additional security group. Okay, when I first looked at this, I thought it was a little bit confusing because it says, well, there are no security groups associated with this Workspaces environment. When you deploy a directory and when you deploy your Workspaces services, Amazon will create for you 2 default security groups. Here they are here. Okay. When you see the underscore controllers, that's the that's the security group associated with the directory service. And then you have the security group for the Workspaces solution. This is the default one, which means this is what's assigned unless you modify your security group setting here. Okay. This allows you to add an additional security group. It is important to note right here that you can see the security group will be applied to both rebuilt workspaces and new workspaces. That means for an existing workspace, it won't get the changed or the additional security group added to it once it's been deployed. So just a couple things to keep in mind in the directory setup. You've also got the ability to allow local administrator access. Okay, so basically what this does is your users become local administrators on their workspaces. That may make sense for you. It might not make sense for you. So you can disable that right away. Okay? It is important, just like working on your regular desktop, that if they don't have local administrative access, they're not going to be able to, install applications, modify settings, which might be what you want. If you wanted to control that, my suggestion would be the I keep saying workplace, Workspace Application Manager, the WAM solution. This would allow you to manage packages and configurations and remove local administrator. One other thing here that I'll mention is maintenance mode. So maintenance mode allows us to basically maintain our workspaces. One of the best ways to manage cost is to set your workspace to auto stop. That means after a certain period of inactivity, the workspace will automatically shut down. Okay. There are a couple pricing models for workspaces. You can pay just straight per hour, or you could pay a flat fee and then a certain amount of cost per hour when those machines are running. At least for the workstations or workspaces that we've deployed over the last week, in most cases, when you do the math, if you expect that workspace to be running, every day during work hours, you would have to sit down and understand the pricing model. But in many cases, it does make sense to do the flat rate, and then you get the reduced per hour cost. Okay. Auto stop is a way, though, to help you manage that cost. Period of inactivity ceases or stops that workspace from operating. Okay. And you can see what happens here is if we have maintenance mode enabled, what will happen is the workspace, Amazon will do this on your behalf. It will automatically start that workspace at once a month and make sure that all of the updates are done on that Windows machine on your behalf. Okay, so this is something that I would suggest you leave on, just to make sure that everything does maintain the operating system and everything is up to date as best you can. Okay. So just a couple things that I wanted to point out there. I did deploy myself a workspace prior to starting up the Q&A session today. And you can see some details about my workspace. Okay. That, I think, is the majority of the content that I wanted to go through today. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, I think we're going to call it there. Thanks for joining us today. It's our first Twitch broadcast, so we're kind of learning as we go with a couple of these things. So I appreciate there were a few little glitches right at the beginning. I'm not sure if they showed up in the stream or not, but we madly fixed those up. So hopefully this was good quality. We're going to run these more often now, so keep an eye within LinkedIn, or if you subscribe here in our Twitch channel, you'll know when we're online. We're going to do some more Q&As and some more demos as we go through the next month or two over the spring and summer. So thanks very much, everybody. Take care. Stay safe. Hope to see you back soon.